in the next hour, what I would like to try to do is explain, in a certain sense, the process of reinventing ourselves. We are still in and will be in forever, but we have taken that on very seriously in the last 5 or 6 years. And those of you who know Genesis Forum, we used to be a program center, and we being especially Larry and Jean Edwards and myself, and then those persons who came and joined us over our early years, we're just trying to design courses that would explore a new cosmology in 2 ways. One, through the scientific, rigorous study of how the universe came to be to the degree we could, and we were very fortunate to have, especially to have Larry Edwards, who really was an extraordinary mind and understood it, great teacher, scientist. And we brought in lots and lots of people from the local region who were adept at various aspects of the implications. Okay, so if the universe story is true, if Earth's evolution is true, then what? And then we look at bioregionalism, and then we look at rethinking all of our human enterprises and experiences and institutions out of the context that Earth was the primary source of them. So if we have human healthcare, it's because Earth is a self-healing planet. Healing is essential in the memory of cells, in the DNA of all living organisms, how to repair itself. So then we look at our institutions and see from that perspective, were they helping? Were they part of the problem? What are alternatives? Not with any sense that we were coming up with answers, only a sense of direction where we needed to go further. Now, in 2005, it was clear to us that the programs we were doing in the past, especially for 15 years of people coming and living and immersing themselves and being accredited through universities we were working with, that phase was coming to an end. We could see that. And, but it took us another 5 years to try to adjust to see whether we could create alternatives to the same content, but in different time formats. And we experimented a great deal with that. But it wasn't until 2010 that there just seemed to be indicators that we had to kind of rethink everything. Not because the content of exploring a new cosmology, which is our mission, it's core to the mission of Genesis Forum. It's not that the content was not the same, essential, but the form in which we were doing it was not available to all but a handful of people. And we just needed to rethink it all. So we did something very, very drastic. We just stopped doing it and went into a kind of limbo and reduced expenditures, reduced staff, reduced what we were doing, and went into a deep internal search. Now, I'm speaking in language that's very metaphorical, but these are real people, real place. You know, it was not a simple process, but it was clear that we had to rethink and reinvent the form in which we were doing it. So after 2 years or so, we began to describe this process of rethinking as a chrysalis. And so we called it the chrysalis. Our board understood, you know, our neighbors, you know, I mean, they knew we were a little crazier than we used to be. And so that's what we did, very intentionally. And then it was like trying to imagine what the forms would be for how we could take the same core mission and make it and bring it into form. And I suspect we'll always be in that process. because things keep changing in the outer world. And economically, politically, things are falling apart faster than I think anyone ever could have predicted, including Thomas. And he was pretty on target with his predictions about the major institutions of the planet, especially of the Western world. So I just wanted to say that in terms of background. You know, I mean, our website, everything just went into a cocoon. And we still had to survive financially, and we still had a small staff and had to meet all of the requirements to be a 501c3. And so that change was enormous, psychologically, spiritually, economically, socially, politically. It really was. And it was happening at the same time that my Dominican congregation was also facing into what all congregations are facing into, the demise of our numbers, our institutions, our resources, and trying to find a succession plan so that we would give over to the future whatever of our legacy we could possibly do as authentically and responsibly. So both were going on at the same time as, you know, kind of, well, I don't want to say little pressure, they were enormous pressures. And, so I wanted to describe a little bit of some of the process and what were some of the key elements in that. So there's a book, and the name of the book is Saving Paradise, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'm just going to talk about this very briefly, and I'm sorry to be talking so much, but I don't know what else to do. Okay, someone gave me this book back in 2007 or 2008, and first I was not interested. It didn't attract me at all. But the person who gave it to me, I trusted and respected highly. And so I don't know what winter I picked it up, but I did. And then as soon as I was able to get beyond the first part of it, I got pulled in so deeply that I probably read it 3 times now. And it's a big, thick book. So I just want to explain a couple of things that were critical in that book. One, it was written by 2 women theologians, and they were Unitarians, and they were just on a mission to find out for themselves where the notion of paradise came from and why Jesus, as dying on the cross, was such a late image in the evolution of biblical history. So you can read all the details on that, and I can't encourage you enough. I'm going to get to the essence of what was most significant for us, is the idea that paradise, from ancient Sumeria to almost the 10th century, was not seen as where you went after you died. Now, I'm generalizing, but it comes out loud and clear. In other words, it's a utopian vision that has been part of human evolution, that there is something more than what we're doing now that activates hope or energy or visionary energy in a group, and they try to create within the conditions in which they're living, where they're living, when they're living, who's there, the conditions that would make the highest possible of human fulfillment and satisfaction possible. And that is paradise. It isn't a notion that once upon a time there was paradise and something happened and now we've got this mess that we have to go through until we get to paradise, which will be at another time, but not here on the earth. And so it was more, what are the conditions that make life filled with beauty and purpose and meaning? So, and I may be interpreting these women, Rebecca Parker and anyway, I may be interpreting it from my own perspective, but for me, it was an elucidation of these conditions that humans are capable of bringing into existence in form and in societies, that are filled with, this is their term, ethical grace. Ethical grace. And so one of them is that the human community, wherever it is at the point that they're describing, you had to live in harmony with the natural world around you. If the humans were destroying Earth around them, there was no possibility for paradise. That's number one, fundamental. Number two was that the humans in that setting, wherever they were, couldn't grow to a size where they didn't know each other. It was based on knowing who was in the community, knowing each other in a relational way. Once a group got too large, it would become almost impossible to have paradise. Another element was that because knowing who was there, you could create a sense of caring for the least vulnerable or the ones that were more susceptible to whatever. And if any one person in the group got out of hand, the only way you could restore paradise was to tell that person to leave. You couldn't have injustice or oppression one against the other. And if a person stepped out of line, they had to leave. But not forever. They could ask to come back in, but they would have to meet the conditions by which they changed their behavior, and then the community would accept them back in again. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Another element in paradise was that the group itself could not acquire so much material, wealth, or possessions or stuff that it became difficult to defend it, to secure it. And if for any reason they got out of hand and they took what they needed from another group nearby, in other words, go to war or practice violence, that it absolutely made it impossible for that group to have a paradise. So there could not be the sense of empire or aggression. Another interesting element was that everyone in the group was an integral part of the community. And when a person died, they were not considered finished. So the dead were always seen as part of the community, and they were included in everything the community did. So feasts or festivals or rituals, and their wisdom and memory was kept alive, so the group had that to draw from. And another, there's a whole slew of them, of conditions. But the whole thing was that the group itself was about the creation of beauty. But the purpose, without beauty, form, gardens, art, music, ritual, without beauty, you couldn't have paradise. It was the striving for what was beautiful, both in relationships among humans and in everything that they built. And that created grace, ethical as well as material grace, beauty. And one of the conditions for keeping that alive was the discipline the group imposed upon itself through ritual. Ritual was the way they kept reminding themselves what they were, their purpose was. Well, I'm really probably taking a lot of liberties with what that book really was saying, but then it traced how all of that changed historically, institutionally, especially at the time of Constantine, when the church and the empire became the same. And then, especially in the time of Charlemagne, how the whole spirituality. Now, they tracked all of this historically through iconography, through archaeological sites, through mosaics, through texts in ancient scrolls. It is the most fascinating insight into the notion of paradise. What we took away from it, when I say we now, I'm going to be talking about the little staff at Genesis Farm and those other people who, would go into conversations with us about this stuff. And so I wanted to say that because it was a seminal work, and it, in a certain sense, was a different approach, but was making the same point as the New Cosmology. Because Thomas would often say, we have never in the West really given ourselves a chance to live within the condition Earth actually gives us, with death being normal. Death is normal. And the way you understand where death comes from, you have to go back in evolutionary time and see when cellular death first came about, and it was about 1 billion years ago in the oceans when simple cells were replicated themselves by cell division. And again, this book, The Universe Story, is the narrative where you can find all of that, or you can go to many, many other sources. But this is what Thomas and Brian were, saying way back in 1992, but it's validated by so much we've come to understand about the nature of cellular death. And so death is a change of form. And it was a necessary process when, at the same time, simple cells that used to divide, and then the child would look like the mother, single cells. Nothing would have happened if cell division kept going that way. You just have clones all the way for all eternity. And so that couldn't change until you had sexual reproduction, which was about 1 billion years ago at the same time. And then cells with different genetic information in their memory gave to a new being half of the genetic memory of the parents, of the male and the female. It took a long time to perfect within the life of simple cells. And around that same time, death was invented, because the complexity that was made possible through sexual reproduction meant that we're going to have multicellular organisms and much more complex organisms. And so one of the constraints that evolved out of that process was that cells would have a certain amount of time in which they could replicate, times by which they could replicate. You might get, I'm making this up because I'm not a scientist, say a cell might get 30 divisions, but not 31. That's how aging happens. That's how organisms can't renew the vital energy that they had at an earlier stage. So death is the condition on which complex life was able to come into being. So we now can trace death as it emerges in the whole ascendancy of life from the oceans onto the land, and it's part of everything. And if there wasn't death, there couldn't be an earth. It couldn't be. So the fact that we thought it was a punishment is what Thomas said. It's, we've never had a chance to accept life and death on the terms of earth as it really is. We could only accept it on the terms of the meanings we had invented, or our ancestors had invented, and God bless them, they were doing the best they could to figure out what just happened to a person who 1 minute was talking and another minute dies. They didn't know how to explain that. And we still don't know what really happens, except the rate of expansion of the universe says that nothing, because the universe is one with itself, nothing can leave. Nothing can die out. A form changes, but the essence remains present. So now, I'm not a biologist or an expert in any of this, but it changed the way we started to think about death. And then how to express that became a phase of this being in the chrysalis. How do we communicate that idea? And I'm describing this because it wasn't easy. I would still go to funerals and hear the same rune system when internally they were inconsistent with each other. And there's no answer. There's just the tension between those different perceptions and some deep intuitive sense nobody can leave. And it was interesting to read that in these ancient utopian communities who were creating paradise, the dead stayed. They were very much a part of the community of the living. And I don't mean their bones and stuff. I mean their spirit, which is they never thought they left. And in many cultures, that's still very alive. The Day of the Dead is very alive. In many cultures, it's understood. So anyway, that book it reinforced a lot of the insights coming from the universe story in a way that was unexpected, and yet they resonated. So I'm just describing that as part of this process we were going through. I remember early in this process waking up and saying to myself, it was just a thought, I must have been dreaming about it, but I woke up in the middle of the night and I realized, and I said, the poles are out of alignment. On our hillside, and anyone who ever studied at the farm, we used to have a teepee on top of this hill. And in front of it were 4 poles that had been put into the ground, cedar posts, to mark the 4 cardinal directions. And we had been gathering there for years in the morning, and we would do this, we called it a body prayer. We would face the directions and we would do these gestures as a way of aligning ourselves with the 4 directions and the 4 seasons. And I think we began celebrating the equinoxes and solstices at the farm probably the year after we went there. We started in 1981, because they seemed important. So there is this hillside outside of the barns and library that have these poles on them and this teepee where we have been gathering to do rituals for years. And I woke up saying the poles are out of alignment, meaning it had bothered me for years, but I never said anything because the volunteers had taken measurements and with a compass and put the poles in the ground to be aligned with the actual cardinal directions of north, east, west, east, south, west, and north. And they did it, and it was hard work, and I never had the heart to say they're wrong. So you sort of live with that, but it doesn't make it go away. So that's what the dream was about. So to make a very long story short, a former student of ours is now the head of the geography department at a university in southern New Jersey, Rowan University. His name is John. And he came in his 20s. He's now the chair of the department. of Rowan University's geography department. And he has a laboratory where his department has all of these computers in order to create GIS mapping, which is satellite vision. You connect with the satellite. Don't ask me how they do it, but then the satellite looks down on Earth and can take pictures. And they're going around the Earth all the time taking pictures, but they store all of this data on software. And John can make maps from the satellite. Anyone can do it now. It's just easy. Google Earth. If you have Google Earth on your computer, you can pull up satellite images of what happened a year ago on your land. So it was a fascinating thing, and I was always fascinated by it, but I called John and said, John, our poles are out of alignment, and I don't know where due, east, south, and west is. Can you help me? So I want to show you a couple of pictures, which then gave us a vision that we could then work with. Okay, this is a slow process. But what I did know was if the 4 poles were out of alignment, we were not really reinventing ourselves as a species among the other species. We were sloppy at it. And somehow that suddenly became very important. So Jesse, can we go to the next picture? And that should be of the valley. You see the barns? Is that up? Okay. See the teepee at the top of the hill on? Okay. Now, that's the top of a hill which comes down to a stream and then goes up another hill to the other side. And this is called the Valley of Aluna. It's taken on a mythological dimension. Aluna really means paradise in Kochi. It means I can see the future. I can see something possible, but it's not here yet. So we were thinking, what if we made the land the teacher of our 12-week program? It knows the whole story. The soils know, the rock bed know, the trees know, the forests know. Everything knows the story. We just don't know how to interpret it. So what if we shifted from running courses that people came for 12 weeks to study, and we shifted to saying the land is going to be the teacher, the major teacher and the major interpreter, the major inspiration, the major beauty, the central one. And this valley became the focus of where that could happen. And on that hillside, up by that teepee at the top there, were the 4 poles. And they've been there forever. I mean, for many years. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay, now do you have a GIS map with
Yes.
lines going out? Okay, the center of that picture is Genesis Farm. We wanted to see if we were praying in the 4 directions and we wanted to pray in 8 directions, we wanted to make 8 poles. So I said, John, if we were standing in the center and going out in 8 directions, where would our energies and prayers be going? And he gave me this image. And so it's the bioregion. And so on the left there, you can see the Delaware River streaming from the top. It's coming down on the left-hand side. And it was illuminating to see when our prayers went out where they were going, or our goodwill, our good intentions. But even more than that, I was blown away by the amount of land still in farmland. Did you see all those fields? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that sort of was another illumination, but the major right now was where were we lined up with from where we are. Now, if you go to the next one, you're going to see an insert that John did for me. And the insert was the shadows of the poles at a certain time seen from space. And then he could work with the shadows and help us get our poles into true alignment with the directions, which we did. Can you see that? All right. Now, the next picture is the Valley of Luna seen from above. All right, and you can see, maybe, let's see the building on the left is the big barn. In front of it are our office buildings. And to the right of the big building is our library. And you see those 4 black lines, those are solar panels. And to the side of the solar panels is a stream. And that stream originates up on an elevated ridge and comes from a deep, deep, deep aquifer, flows through the land, and then leaves at the top. If you were to follow that at the top now, going north, it goes into a wetland and into a neighbor's land, then underneath a road, down a ravine, and the ravine takes that water into the Skill River, which is the river which marks our particular watershed. And where it originates, which is at the bottom of the picture, actually, is a ridge, forested ridge. And we were told by a biology professor that water, he used to bring the students out, and he said he'd study our water and our soils for us. And he said it was the most pristine water he had ever investigated because it came from these limestone aquifers. And the limestone was left by warm, shallow seas that used to cover Genesis Farm in between ice ages. And limestone is the fossilized shells of quadrillions of marine organisms. That's what limestone is, it's calcium. And the waters under limestone are the Earth's most pristine waters because it purifies. So this is what became clear to us. It's like we would have known it, but it was not in front. It was not in our consciousness. The land that's part of what's called Genesis Farm, 231 acres that the Sisters of St. Dominic received a piece of paper from saying, you hold the deed, you own this land. Whatever that means. But the deed says it's in our hands. So on the one hand is this water coming from the evolutionary process of deep time, pure, pristine, total gift, no death in it, no contamination. It's never seen the light of day. It flows through our Valley of Luna, out the valley into the wetlands, to the neighbors, down under the road, into the ravine, down to the Skill River, which flows into the Delaware River and is in total threat of being contaminated through fracking. So on the one hand, we have the gift, and on the other, it's fate. What does that mean to the person or organization that has a piece of paper saying, this is in our hands? Blew us away. I mean, it sounds so, of course, but no, what does it really mean for 7 generations in the future? So then something else happened. And we were invited by the wife of a very famous architect. Perhaps some of you have studied the work of Christopher Alexander. He lives in England now. He's elderly and he's failing. But he used to be the head of UC Berkeley architecture department and famous among architectural circles because he was such a rebel against modernity. I'm not going to go into his whole story, but you could. He's been an inspiration to us long before I ever met him. And he got a call from a group in New England, but it was a virtual group, asking if they could take the principles of design he had written about in his books and apply them to a small level, because he designed city centers, he designed university campuses, he designed big buildings. And so how do you take those principles from the earth and use them in your backyard? This is what they were asking, and create beauty. So they got in touch with him in England, and his wife came over asking permission of us, could we use Genesis Farm as a place where a group of this virtual community would gather to design a project at a very, very small level that would incorporate these principles. And they're called the principles of wholeness. And they're really earth principles. So make a long story short, this group comes, they design this little area, tiny little area, which I'm going to show you a picture of. Next picture, please. Okay, it should be just a little grove with a bench and a pole and, okay? And that eventually, through the process, they came for 5 days and designed that little space. It was excruciating. And we knew it was going to be what we wanted to call a grove in honor of our founders. Now, Thomas Berry obviously was a founder of Genesis Farm, his thought. So now it's not like they found the place, the Dominican sisters founded it, but the principles on which it was built since 1980 were the legacy of other people who had affected those of us who came to create Genesis Farm. We didn't know it that consciously, but it was incorporated into our earliest mission statement, but vaguely, like veiled. So this group grilled us. What does this mean? What do you want to do here? They were here for 5 days, but the questions were about the meaning of Genesis Farm. So it revealed to us slowly that this grove of the founders was to be a very, very special place through which the stream ran. And so I wanted to show you the pictures of who we actually began identifying as the founders. In other words, if you took any of these actors out, they're all dead. But if you took any of them away, Genesis Farm's mission would not have been what it was for 36 years. Okay, so here's the first one. Of course, it's St. Dominic. Had he not created this order that was about contemplating and then giving away the fruits of the contemplation, and if he had not been a renegade himself, because he was a monk, he was an Augustinian monk, and in those days you couldn't leave the monastery once you became a monk. And he wanted to get out into the byways of Europe and engage with ideas and discourse, and there were all kinds of things going on, and he had to petition the Pope for permission to get out of the monastery himself, but be monastic, but itinerant monastic. And he and Francis of Assisi were good friends, and they both wanted to do that. So without that, there wouldn't have been the Dominican sisters of my congregation, to whom Genesis Farm was bequeathed, left in somebody's will. And the next slide is of the woman who was the prioress at the time, Sister Margaret Thomas. And we consider her and Dominic essential elements. Take either of them out of the equation and you wouldn't have had Genesis Farm and its mission. And even though Marge didn't really have the opportunity to study Thomas deeply or understand the cosmological and the implications that Genesis Farm was trying to do, she had total trust in it and its vision. And without her, it wouldn't have happened. She was in the right place at the right time. Next is a photograph of a Dutch artist, Dutch Jew, who fled Holland during the Nazi era, came to the United States. His name is Frederick Frank. He's a pretty famous artist, poet, philosopher. He's written a good number of books. And he created a sanctuary, a sculpted out of an old mill, a place dedicated to the human spirit, the indestructibility of the human spirit, about 45 minutes away from us along the same Appalachian corridor. The name of his place is Pachim in Terrace, and I was an art student at one time in my life and studied with him. So his vision touched me deeply, and we became friends, he and his wife and his son, and I'm on the board of Pachim and Terrace, and he was very, very solicitous of Genesis 1. And his belief in art and beauty, not prettiness, but real beauty, authentic truth, was very, very, very strong in the way we have tried to develop whatever we've done at Genesis Farm. So we consider him a founder. Next, some of you may recognize Jerry Mishi. Jerry and Pat Mishi were very, very close friends. And I worked at Global Education Associates for several years prior to coming to Genesis Farm. And their mentoring of me in global systems and peacemaking and the strength, the capacity of a strengthened United Nations to participate in finally arbitrating differences among the nation states rather than through war was another essential element of Genesis Farm from the beginning in our mission statement. And he was a founding member of our first board of trustees, as I was on the board of trustees of Genesis Farm. Next, we don't have a photograph of this person, so I'm showing you an icon in the grove that has been put there in his memory. And his name was Dr. Walter Bernstein, and he was a local physician who gave up his practice because he said, and he was brilliant, I cannot make people well if the food and water are toxic and poisoned. And he stopped practicing, and he founded an organization called Food and Water, and they published a journal for years. And he was a brilliant strategist. So he was an advocate for the food and the water, and he was an activist like no one else I ever met. And he was on our founding board, we were on the board of Food and Water. So it was this interconnection of all these forces that just made Genesis Farm what it really was to become. And then next is Thomas Berry, and his presence and his impact was core. It was probably the most significant because he changed the whole sense of time and history from human historic time to deep evolutionary time as the primary reference for religion, for health, for education, for agriculture, for food, for governance, for law, for ethics, for just about everything. And he had given us a little seedling of a tree that used to be in front of the place where he did his writing at the Riverdale Center in New York. And that tree, which was outside of his window, was there when Henry Hudson sailed up the Hudson River. That's how old it was. And he would take acorns and sprout them. And he gave us one on our 10th anniversary. And that tree is in the grove of the founders, and it's like 30 feet, 40 feet high now. So that grove is like the land, and all the icons there tell the story of reinventing the human. And our hope is we will finally at some point get to writing an interpretive guide that a person could come on their own and sit down in that grove and learn all about the biography of the people there, but their vision and how that's essential to laying the foundation for imagining a new earth community. Because you can't take any of those pieces out with respect to, at least the Genesis Farm. So the next picture is a bridge from the Grove of the Founders. We call that the Grove of the Founders to another section of the land. Now, if you go to the next slide, the little bridge across the stream, the beautiful stream. There's a kind of GIS map of looking back down on the Valley of Aluna. And it just gives you an aerial view. And okay, so you see those, what look like, it looks like a worm almost. There's a pathway from the grove to the hillside. Now this hillside is where we commemorate to the left. You see those two, oh my gosh, I don't have the language for this. They look like two squiggly lines.
Yes.
Okay, those are mounded structures called hugelkultur. It's a permaculture design where you build a mound, and they go with the contour of the hill. Into those mounds, we have been planting an orchard, and every tree planted is in memory of somebody who we knew or whose family said, "May we bury the ashes here. May we have a memorial, maybe have our memorial here at Genesis Farm." So those two rows were the first rows we had started to put in this picture here. There's now 5 rows all the way up the hill. And we have about 40 trees in the last 3 years. And it is our way of saying the dead don't leave. We call that the hillside of the ancestors. Next slide is a little angel, an old statue we found in some flea market. And it's just sort of an image of the angelic, which in deep time or in Jungian's unconscious, collective unconscious, angels could be a metaphor for the deep intuitive of every human spirit. Because if the dead can't leave and they stay, is their presence part of the collective memory of birth that's in the collective memory of each of us in the unconscious realm? And when we ask for visions or dreams, or we pray to the saints or the communion of the saints, by evoking them, we bring up memory, we bring up intuition, we bring up vision, possibilities. So we interpret the angelic realm as the message between the dead and the living. And it's all one. It's all in the collective. It's all in the universe or itself. There's only one soul. There can't be separation anywhere. So we're just trying to find ways to articulate that. And we don't know what we're talking about, so don't believe me. Next picture is you start to see the orchard as it's evolving. And in this particular picture, I think, there are lanterns or luminaria. I have only a tiny one. But when we have our celebrations of the equinoxes and the solstices or we mark the 8 passages of the seasons every year as in ritual. Then we cross over the bridge to the place of the dead. We call it the hillside of the ancestors, and leave gifts and bring back prayers or whatever from them. It's like we include them in everything. Next picture is a picture of a person burying remains under a tree, the ashes, and many of those trees have people's ashes under them. So when the tree produces a peach from its roots, it's a literal interpretation of that. And then the next picture is a transition on the hillside of the ancestors. We are planting ancient prairie grasses that used to be there, that used to be throughout the Northeast and have almost been lost. And we're revitalizing, planting them for purposes that I can talk about in another time, because they can be pelletized when they are harvested and used for fuel and burned in a special kind of furnace, and they have no carbon emissions. They sequester all the carbon in their roots. So we're planting that on the hillside of the ancients too. And then we walk across the stream and come to the hillside of the living, where there are solar panels and a series of gardens, which are demonstration gardens in an attempt to show how much food can be grown in a very, very limited space, which would be particular to where people actually live. We have a huge CSA. It's been there 28 years, and it has been grown with the methods of Rudolf Steiner biodynamically. It supports 300 families. But all those principles in that kind of agriculture, we wanted to say, can you do that in your backyard? And if we're going into climate change and economic collapse, how do people become more involved in growing their own food? So these are 4 gardens to show that it is possible. I'm just going to go through them fast. The one you're looking at right there, the solar panels behind it, are raised beds, and therefore anyone in a wheelchair. So it's an accessible garden. The next one is what's called a patio garden, the size of a person's patio if they were living in a townhouse and they're not allowed to have a garden. Next one is also the same patio garden from another vantage point, where instead of having a barbecue in a hammock or whatever, you can actually create a little paradise right in your own patio size with containers, produce food, herbs, and flowers, a little sanctuary to which you can go home after a hard day at the office or wherever you're working. That's another one. Okay, and next is, you see the back of our office. That's a front lawn garden, and it's meant to mimic people living in row houses in the city who have no backyard, all concrete, but they have a front yard and everybody grows chem lawn. How can you change that into a very, very productive and beautiful garden? Next one, we'll just keep going. And as you walk up that hillside, you also pass a straw bale house, which is made from growing grains. And taking the straw and building a house out of that, and that has a composting toilet inside and a gray water system and solar space heaters on the top of it. And then further up the hill, next images of stations on that hillside dedicated to what Thomas Berry in the great work calls the path of the fourfold wisdom. That we can draw on the wisdom of indigenous peoples, the wisdom of women who had matrilineal societies long before the beginning of patriarchy, which comes with the classical religions. So we have 30,000 years of memory of living without patriarchal gods and war and physical power over. And then the fourth wisdom is the wisdom of science. And on the hillside are stations that represent those. And these were just some of those images. And that's where we do our rituals 8 times a year in the seasonal changes, and every morning when we come to work, we go up there and do the same prayer in the directions. So I'm going to end there with that being how we are trying to let the land become the teacher. And a person could drive down the driveway, park their car, walk into a little area, be welcomed and be given an interpretive guide that would take them all the way through all of that. So they could do it on their own, at their own pace, and it would be filled with whatever,